it is magical. This kind of simplicity and complexity is inconceivable. And quickly, the beautiful swirls has emergent properties, right? It cannot be replicated. The opposite of depression is not happiness,
but with such depth and richness. I could sit and listen to that whole presentation right over again.
So my word for Holos is basically integration. It's just another idea that has come to me over these years. In the US, in my current context, integration is connected to the idea of racial integration. And in some ways, I like that connection because racial integration, the core of it is that there is no other. And so for me, the integration is essentially to expand that sense of no other to everything. That if we look deeply, there is really no other. There is nothing that is not ourself. Okay, becoming aware of our mental maps. So let's start with maps. This, of course, is a map of Africa. What is wrong with this picture?
States.
All the divisions.
The division in states.
The division of states, meaning the boundaries, the borders?
Yeah, the borders.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And in particular, those straight lines. So this is a realization I had when I was 9. I was looking at the map one day in China, and all of a sudden I had the sense that those straight lines across vast territories of plains and desert, that just couldn't possibly make any sense on the ground. And later I was able to see with my own eyes in West Africa how there are roads that lead to nowhere. There's simply one way, extracting resources from inland to the ports. They do not actually form any useful networks for the local people. So I just saw how this is actually an imposition on the land, rather than sort of the rhetoric of colonizers creating infrastructure that's useful for the development of the places. China, for all its problems, actually do not have any straight lines as such, because it has a much longer history. Whereas in the US, especially in the West, you can see also, right? Someone took a ruler, essentially, to a map of the territory and drew some lines. If you fly low over these areas, you can also see essentially planned communities, straight roads into the desert, for example, near Las Vegas, cul-de-sacs. And again, I had the sense, how could this make any sense? Why would you want to live with no relationship to the land whatsoever in these straightly drawn, planned, McMansions? Australia, almost the size of US and China, essentially have such few precious lines, right? These are essentially a settling of games of power between the powers that be. And I started to, when I look all over the map, I started to get a sense that big people, grown-ups, can do some very strange things that are actually quite insane. And when I was growing up, I was quite a sort of good girl. I was a rule follower. I was not a boundary pusher. But this was my first understanding that there's much more wisdom on the level of the details of the land than any kind of regime or rules imposed by societies, by powers. Let's go back to the map of Africa for a moment. What we saw, and a map of the watersheds of the land. You can see there are a few places where it sort of follows the watershed, but still there's much more richness. You can just get a sense of the terrain from the map on the right. This image just happens to come across my Facebook feed, and in the comments, someone compared it to a picture of the placenta. which I thought was quite wise. There's a level of richness of people being in the land and being a part of the land that you wouldn't get from territories of powers, essentially, of extraction. Yes, and I agree that borders are inherently not correct. And I did have a sense then at age 9 that hopefully in my lifetime that national boundaries would go away, replaced by something more intrinsic and more integral to the land itself. I don't know what form that might take, but I still have of my life left, and I'm still hopeful of that. So with experiences like this, I start to understand that no matter where we come from, there is essentially a kind of box in space that we live in. And later in my life at 18, I came to America, and it was a lot to go through as a young immigrant and not speaking the language. What really helped me was to essentially to understand that there are these spaces, these boxes that we operate in. And because I've known 2 of them, I know there's a vast amount of space on the outside of it. And therefore, not to take any of it as the right way to do things. And even though each of these cultures, and as many cultures do, assume itself to be the center, I understood that the space around is more important. The time of China that I grew up in is very different than China of today. There were no highways. People still cooked essentially with lumps of coal, and there was no running hot water inside of houses. So I come straight to San Francisco Bay Area to highways that look like this, and learning to drive and so on, and navigating all this complexity, which was definitely overwhelming and confusing, to say the least. So understanding these kinds of frameworks helped. And just to simply know that there is something other than these sort of rules I must learn in order to operate, that there's a kind of success outside of what might be defined conventionally as functioning well and getting ahead and so on. There is a sort of simplicity that I was longing for slowly over time. I went to some San Francisco Zen Center talks. I slowly had more and more sense of recognition, which eventually led to the Zen Center, which I'll talk about. But I also started to become a designer and to work in technology, and which is also overwhelming its way, and certainly have become much more so in the last few decades. So I started to do essentially what would be called now a media diet. And as useful as something like National Public Radio has been in my life, and prior to that, Voice of America, shortwave radio, I started to be very conscious of limiting of what I let into my psyche. And because the more, there's a tension between the modern and the timeless. I need to be informed sufficiently to be a caring citizen and to do my work, but I also need enough empty space to be in touch with something of the timeless. Sanity, right? Basic sanity is not to be taken for granted in this day and age. When I started to live at the Zen Center, outside of the Silicon Valley proper, but basically within commutable times, I had this different mental model contrast, which is I would say one of the most significant mental model shifts that has helped me. A place like Silicon Valley, and I assume in Europe as well, people talk about work-life balance all the time, which has often struck me as rather strange, because if we spend essentially 9 to 6 or whatever it is of our work days at work, that's the best time that we have the energy. So what do we mean work-life balance? How could those two things actually be in tension with each other, right? Or not be completely the same. Work is life, life is work. So I started to see that there's something wrong, that if you really think about it, this is a zero-sum game, right? The mental model of it is linear. And one side gets more, the other side must get less. And that's actually not quite right. When I was initially doing some self-retreats at the Zen Center, some of the residents started saying to me, "You seem like a good fit. Why don't you live here?" And I said, no. I don't have the time to do, regular meditation morning and evening. I don't have time for the regular extra responsibilities of being a resident at this functioning center. I don't think I can handle the additional commute, right? So but like so many things, unless we try it, we actually don't know how else it changes things. It changes things from the inside out. So when I started living there, I felt the evening times actually attained the kind of richness. When I took a walk on the ridge outside of the Zen Center, or when I set the evening meditation session and then have these random conversations with the residents, I was so much more nourished by that time, even though it was actually short. So time took on a different kind of significance and richness. So the idea, the mental picture I came up with is a drop of ink in water. And we've all seen that, right? How liquids merge and quickly, the beautiful swirls has emergent properties, right? It cannot be replicated at all. It's unique every single time. And it quickly becomes completely integral to each other and can no longer be separated. So the sense that I had was that my meditation was the ink and the rest of my life is the water. It actually infuses everything that I do, right? From washing the dishes to going to work and talking to my team. It gives a different sense of, one could say, mindfulness, but also even something deeper of non-duality. And by extension, I am that ink and everything I touch is the water. And it's really endless. Like we are all not separated in this essentially alchemical practice, that everything we touch touches everything around us. And there is no end of that influence. So I also at this time was working in technology. In my case in particular was LinkedIn. And a long time before this, right, technology, really in all of our lifetimes in the last couple of decades have transformed everything. And I remember much earlier than my time in Silicon Valley was when, Deep Blue, the computer beat the chess player. And the chess player described how it seemed that the computer was tricking him, right? That the computer had a sort of personality and a deviousness in order to, set up certain assumptions and then go with at it in a different way. And I thought, that consciousness just come from a certain level of complexity. And then we can attribute a kind of soul, a kind of consciousness to something that's sufficiently complex, that it may be more of a projection. And recent years now, AI, of course, used to be thought of not much of a thing, and now, of course, it's everything, right? It's going to influence everything. This is a little cartoon where you can see the luggage, right, is delighted to see its owner, and the owner delighted to see this piece of luggage. So it is really interesting, right? I think we've all had moments of a sense of emotional connection to some of our devices, right? And these are still very, very primitive devices. And they will certainly get much more complex and much more, I do think, humanoid robots would certainly be the case quite soon. And my hope, I'm actually not a technology optimist. I don't hold some of the optimistic views as I think I know some folks here do. However, I do think having this child, essentially consciousness of AI, of robots, can help us be more conscientious and be more aware of what we do with our consciousness. And this is idea held by Kevin Kelly, who's a former founder of Wired magazine, and he writes quite compellingly in a book called What Technology Wants. And I think, being a parent myself, I see some truth to that, right? Because just as with parents, as parents, we don't really know what we're doing with AI. However, it's a love of the thing. It's a feeling that this little being or this thing we're creating is not an other, that makes us come from a more holistic way of creating it, more thoughtful. So that's my hope for technology. And it may be technology telling us these things, but right now we are telling technology very, very basic things, right? But it probably would be quite soon when we start to tell technology and versions of AI, be yourself. So some other ways of frameworks that I started to think about as coming from sort of the balance versus integration sort of comparison. One of them is how this linear materialistic thinking is really limiting everything that we do. So many things, our language often have the assumption of things being linear, right? So then we are all of a sudden already being in a mind of lack because there's competition, right? There's win-lose in some way. So what if we add a dimension, right? When we talk about innovation, which as in my work, I did constantly, you can see actually a line, when you put it on a graph like this, has a kind of creative tension. You can imagine if this is a rubber band, you can pull the middle, right? And it will snap to the opposite direction. And that's often how we talk about in terms of innovation, is that within constraint, and creativity needs constraints, there can be a possibility of more than where it comes from. And another idea that I had about this adding a dimension is, what if you actually bend this line, right, and make it a circle? Because in nature, actually, the opposite, we know that this in spirituality as well, the opposites of something is actually often essentially the same thing if you push something to the extreme. And the example I sometimes use is simplicity and complexity in nature. If you think about the eye of a fly, for example, it's extraordinarily complex. It is an amazingly simple organism that nature was able to evolve in an amazing way. And we've all seen pictures of, for example, the murmuration of starlings, right? The rule is actually very simple. Each bird tracks its 7 closest neighbors, yet the whole can perform smoothly, right? And it is magical. This kind of simplicity and complexity is inconceivable to our brain, yet it happens in nature all the time. And of course, this circle is also the idea of an enzo in Asian cultures, and specifically to Zen Buddhism, which for me is connected to a few principles of essentially a kind of, for me, a creativity and life framework, which is incompletion, impermanence, imperfection. and how that really helps for me in life and work, so that I don't fall into the traps of linear thinking, of a mind of lack and stress, of not being able to fail, or and to the point that I couldn't start something. So as a creative person, this has been really, really helpful to hold these principles in mind, and actually that they are higher goals than those of perfection, permanence, and completion. And the murmuration images also bring me to you probably have seen this video before. These are still captures, The Powers of 10 by Charles and Ray Eames. And Charles and Ray Eames are designers, so I have a lot of kinship to them. And this reminds me, so basically the premise of the video is that when you zoom out or zoom in by 10, it's a completely different ballgame, essentially, that you're looking at, right? From the galaxy to inside the human skin, the cells. And you can see the problems at one level are not going to be the problems at another level when you magnify by 10, right? My favorite quote is that one by Einstein. You cannot solve a problem with the same level of consciousness that created it. So it's very useful to zoom out or zoom in and shift it. And there's another New Yorker cartoon that I want to share with you. I couldn't find the image, but I'll describe it to you. And basically a street corner with people waiting for the bus, people walking home from work. And it's a dreary, rainy day. In my mind, I would imagine it as sort of a London afternoon. And then people looking very sort of depressed and sad. And, a dog is peeing on the fire hydrant and so on. It just seems like everyone's feeling very dull. I'm just wanting this day to be over. And the caption is galaxy detail. Right? So at a different level, our problems don't exist. It's just what we think of as problems. So with that, I also really enjoy this quote by Churchill. It's a mistake to look too far ahead. Only one link of the chain of destiny can be handled at a time. And when we talk about this time of incredible complexity, I think that's important because, at least for me, I have a really hard time thinking of some of the potential solutions, but I can walk one step at a time in terms of the things I can create, the amazing people I can collaborate with, and see what happens. And that helps me be creative and be engaged and be optimistic. And earlier on, I talked about the boxes, the cultural boxes we're in, right? So we can see that there are still the boxes in limiting our language, right? Words like chain and destiny imply a kind of linearness, right? A kind of inevitability. So what if we change the language? Only one link of creativity, only one link of emergence, right? Only one link of what happens in nature can be handled at a time. And we can have a different sense of the possibilities. The chain of destiny have a kind of sort of heavy gravity pull to it. And when we talk about creativity, for me, it feels more open and more closer to what nature works. There is no real destiny in nature. There are inevitabilities or probabilities, but still the principle of it is creative and emergent. So with this way of working, thinking about creativity, there are a few I would say also frameworks that are useful. One is there are more solutions than problems. We tend to be focused on problems, but in reality, there's this abundance of solutions, right? It's overwhelming in a good way. Like whoa, there are so many things that can be done. There are a million ramifications or iterations, variations on what's possible. And that's actually really exciting. It's really exciting for the mind as well as the soul. Another one is that the opposite of anesthetic is aesthetic. That beauty is what moves us. When we feel numb and stuck, often it's the things that are connected to the sense of beauty that holds a sign for where we should be moving to. Scientists often talk about it's a beauty, a promise of beauty, sometimes of elegance in a formula they're working on, and in that guide their discovery, which I find fascinating. And Buckminster Fuller also said that when he's working on things, he doesn't think about whether or not the solution is beautiful, but in the end, if it's not beautiful, he knows it's not right. And the opposite of depression is not happiness, but it's vitality. I did experience depression in my life, so I know that I know what it's like, and I know how common it is, but I know also that I'm very far from it today. Not because my life is easy or just happy, but because I feel very vital. And I see there are a lot of very vital people around me, even during this time of COVID, that it's actually just so, such an extraordinarily vital time, I would say. So I want to read this quote in entirety. You might want to close your eyes because there's a lot there. And this is about how to live, how to actually live, right, in this way of creativity, I would say. And this is from Dogen, who's a 13th century Zen master who started a branch of Zen called Soto Zen in Japan. When a fish swims in water, in the swimming, there is no end to water. When a bird flies in the sky, in the flying, there is no end to sky. This is because from the beginning, they are in accord with the water or the sky. With extensive activity comes extensive use, and with modest activity, less use. Yet essentially and everywhere, the full use is made of all that is functioning, and all that is functioning turns and moves freely. For with the fish, water is life, and for the bird, sky is life. Also for the sky, the bird is life. For the water, the fish is life. Life is bird and sky. Life is fish and water. It is the same with practice, with realization, and with everything in life's duration. For me, this is a lifetime piece of text. And every time I read it, I feel a renewed sense of belonging in this life. And I make the space. And I am that space. And just one last slide. I'm starting this creative residency in the mountains outside of Seattle, and it often gives me insights. And the latest one, when I was standing on this deck, is that the field is sentient. We often, sort of, there are varying, like, narrow or wider definitions of the word sentience. What is sentient, right? And the more commonly accepted understanding is that it's belonging to essentially animals, humans, so things that can move, right? It's not attributed to plants. But I had this sense that, you know what, this forest knows exactly what's happening. I knows I'm here. The owl would check me out when I haven't been there for a while. The tree's roots are as big as the canopies on top. It sends chemical signals to each other, just like a brain, different parts of the brain does. When I cut down some trees so that the forest doesn't swallow the house, the trees know that. And it knows what species are introduced and which ones are native. The forest just knows about this on many different levels, in many time scales than what we think of. We think of linear time, but actually for the earth, time works at a big sort of spectrum. But it knows that we're here. So we're not, to go back to the map in the beginning, our language and our maps sort of assume that we are on the land, but actually we're in the land. The land knows us. The poem Lost by David Wagner, probably many of you know, it says, you're surely lost, stand still. The forest knows where you are. You must let it find you. So the field knows where we are. If we let it feel through us, right? That's a way forward. I will stop here. I will stop sharing for now. I think I actually took over the amount of time I was supposed to. Sorry about that. And there's a set of questions for when we do the breakout groups, but I'll let the facilitators take over for now.
Yingzhao, thank you. Such profound simplicity, but with such depth and richness. I could sit and listen to that whole presentation right over again. But we won't ask you to do that. Thank you so much. In the Holos Project, the overarching theme is human becoming. And what you have emphasized, it is becoming whole, which is not only an inward process, but it is with the very context that enabled us to be in the first place. And you put that so potently and yet simply. Deeply appreciated. Our opportunity now is to go into chat rooms and just explore what we can take from this, what is significant from this. And the question for the group is right at the beginning of the chat box, of the chat column. Have a look. It says, what mental model shifts have helped you in this time and which could help the next wave of people towards a consciousness shift? In our experience, what mental model shift that we're experiencing, what changed our mind? Somebody once said, change your mind and keep the change. What shift in our consciousness helped us? And how can we offer that to the generations that are coming that have to deal with this incredible complexity, and yet you've given us a way to deal with that creative step by creative step. I love that. That is such a potent refrain.
We really do have to determine what it is that creates these artificial boundaries which do not serve to unify, but to divide humanity. And how do we overcome that state of affairs that we're in? And no amount of theorizing and philosophizing is actually going to solve that problem until we can address it in terms of practical politics and economics. That's it.
Well, I can see that's a very vivid perspective in terms of on power, and raises for me the ways that we think about power, I thought one of the things that was very interesting about the presentation was that she was always breaking boundaries and questioning boundaries. And I don't know, at the beginning, we were shown a map of Africa, Howard, which had some straight lines on, and then a natural map of the bioregions based on the river basins, which looked like a pancreas even, a much more natural, with many natural features, no straight lines. And I take your point, Fred, that the way that we think, well, it comes back to her quote of Einstein, that our level of consciousness needs to evolve for us to be able to solve those problems, those problems of the imposition of false boundaries, and get back to some kind of natural community that allows people to relate on a more appropriate level. I don't know whether you have anything to any way of responding to that at all.
Well, no, other than that, of course, Einstein's right. But then the question is, do we have already the information to arouse our consciousness, or is it being suppressed artificially to serve vested interests? I happen to believe the latter. And if that is the case, we need to come to grips with the political problems that are creating these boundaries between human beings, because until we resolve them, it's unlikely that we'll be able to reclimb onto the evolutionary ladder.
Do you have a response to that, Howard?
Yeah, well, I just appreciate it thinking together. I think that I think that there are two things happening at once. I think that there is an evolutionary dynamic at play that is seeking to come into a greater coherence around a restoration of what lives beyond the unnatural boundaries, what's possible. But I think that the introduction or the devolution of identity is something to think about. You know, what is it that has created fragmentation out of natural boundary, or from the state of natural boundaries, and presumably some mutual respect for different clusterings of people in whatever way, to a sort of competition for resources, or a competition for that relates to power and influence. So my belief is that two things happening. There is a rising tide of shifts in consciousness, which I don't think yet has found a critical mass relative to a change in identity. I don't think it's natural for us to have to define ourselves from a regional standpoint. I don't think it's necessary to have to define ourselves from hereditary or lineage standpoints, from culturally speaking. I think it's a pragmatic reality, but I don't think it's necessary. So I believe that the original impulse was based on a transcendent positioning, where identity was itself able to see, view, and have relationship with a whole that would have tremendous diversity. And I think we've lost that fluidity because we haven't been ready to give up the security that we find in a false otherness. We project a false otherness onto our differences. So that's just by way of thinking. And I think breaking boundaries is part of the you could say the greening of consciousness, the releasing of some rigidities in our makeup, collectively speaking. So I'm speaking in the abstract, but I'm hoping it's landing in a way where people can make their own translations from what makes sense to you.
Welcome back, everybody. That was such a gentle space that we were able to occupy. And Yingzhao, you made it possible. Your image of the ink in the water just did it for me. So what we were addressing was your question of what shift in our awareness, in our thinking, in our mental awareness helped us to move, and how can we carry that to the generations that will be facing unique new challenges. And so maybe there's a question that someone would like to put to Yingzhao, or an observation. And Marcus, I see your hand.
Yeah, hi. My question to you, Ying, is what is the attraction to you to live this life along this spectrum at what to me appears like quite extreme ends, at the Zen center and outside or on the periphery of Silicon Valley, in a Silicon Valley technology enterprise that's driven by these, well, from my perception at least, these very old world dynamics in terms of stakeholder value and so forth. What for you is the integration that your life resembles?
Thank you, Marcus. The short answer is survival, right? It's a coping mechanism so that I can survive Silicon Valley. Because by that time I had lived in the mountains, in the same house that I showed a picture of outside of Seattle for a few years. And I recognized a part of me that needed that to be myself and to not get lost in the concrete jungle of Silicon Valley and in the corporate pace. So I started looking for a place to meditate, and luckily found this place that the location of it is so unique that it's in the coastal range, and had a special sense of being welcoming. It also had a unique element, which is that it had a Native American sweat lodge on the grounds, which is extremely unusual for a Japanese Zen place. And Native American practices were actually my first healing tool. So it was just such a unique sign that this is a place for me in some way. And as usual, I was very hesitant because ultimately it's not my culture, and I'm very cautious about stepping into areas and not assume that I should or could be there. But because of my caution, it will actually gain the respect of the people who do practice there. And so their invitation was also a sign that I should be there. So it was very tentative steps, but it fundamentally changed my life in Silicon Valley, and it opened doors. And it's also like, nothing in life really happens accidentally, because by then I lived in the mountains. I've done a lot of experiential education with young people around the world. I've done things that are interesting to me, but they are actually all connected, all integrated without me knowing it. So those parts of my life, I was able to, I think, as probably many of us have that experience. Eventually, I dare to own my life. I dare to say the things that are important to me. I should talk about them, and I should continue to live them instead of just treating them as little side things that are somehow I should not be so, that I should also even like carry a little bit of shame about, that those things are important to me. That so my different parts of my life were no longer secret. I started talking about my Zen life to my corporate people and Native American practices, and talk about, travel to my team who are also from different cultures. So I was able to bring my whole self to work because my whole self was changing. So it was really serendipitous, and I'm very grateful for how that happened, because I had been a manager before, and I would say not a very conscious one. And this time, because of what had happened in my own life, I was much more relatable, and I was open, I was vulnerable, I was able to share simply what's going on with me, and I was able to take risks. And it didn't always work, but now everyone in my corporate environment, of course, liked my language. Some of them would be put off by it, but by then I was okay. I was more than okay with it, because eventually I became very comfortable with ruffling some feathers, and because scale doesn't matter, right? Like, it only matters that I can connect with some people. They're the ones I should be connected to. Does that answer your question?
It's a very beautiful response. I resonate with everything you say very deeply, and thank you for accepting that quite I deliberately provocative question. I appreciate your emergence and the poetry with which you've spoken about it now and in your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus. I always welcome provocative questions.
Thank you. I just want to, before I come to you, Joseph, I just want to see that on the screen, everybody is a friend. It is so beautiful. And some of those friends are very old friends that I haven't seen in a long time. So I just want to say, hi, guys. Long time no see. Joseph.
Thank you, Yingzhao. So what you said about the invitation was what we hand over to the people who are coming. How do you think we can convince those who are coming not to hurry the forest and to be themselves? Because that is a flow which is different from what the current worldview is. How do we convince people? Or should we even convince them or allow them to learn?
Yeah, great question. It's really hard to push against a sense of urgency, isn't it? Mm-hmm. I know for me it is. My life is busy. It's way busier than I would like it to be. And I'm no longer even having an office life. And there is also a sense of urgency in terms of there is work to do, right? And Kurt Vonnegut, one of my favorite writers, had a very prescient book a long time ago that basically said, it's called Time Quake. It basically said, you have been asleep a long time. You're awake now, and there is work to do. He's a personal hero of mine, and I connect with that sensibility. So I think we live with this tension that there is a sense of urgency. And this confusion of being in the forest, being in the field it's uncomfortable, but I don't think that would go away. At least for me, I don't think that would go away. I don't think I can really slow things down tremendously, but I would say there are probably moments of spaciousness and moments of stillness, that timelessness is the inking water that permeates all my hurried activities. Not everything I do is as fruitful as I like. It's not always coming from that deeper place of presence, but I have to trust that process also, and that what presence I do feel and can can impact my actions is enough. And I would say the same for others. You know, when my little group talked about tools, I talked about how nature seems to be a common ingredient for those who have access to spiritual depth. So if they, I would say the main tool I recommend for people is, you know, people who are not already in these conversations, is access to nature, and consistent and long enough access to nature. So because when they feel that connection of being in the land, being in something that's sentient, that I think that has an impact. It may be imperceptible for a while, but it still has an impact. You know how we walk into a forest and often we're focused on, you know, our timeline, you know, for this trail, etc. But eventually, often people have a sense of like a relaxation because we're in something with a lot of density, with a lot of information. So I think that's the best I can recommend, is for people to access that embodied sense of being held by nature. And that would slow down some aspect of their life, and it would infuse it with a deeper sense of knowing.
Thank you. Denise, I saw your hand.
Yes, but I also know it's just have to. I don't want to push over. Can I ask this question? So thank you. I'll ask this a very quick question. In the presentation, you talked about your guiding principles: incomplete, impermanence, and imperfection. How do those guide you?
Yeah, also the umbrella for those is wabi-sabi, is a Japanese term that means those things. Yeah, it really guides everything that I do as a parent, as a professional, as an artist, is allow things to be humble and to be very small and to fail and to be a scratchy sketch that I revised later. It has significantly lowered the initial barrier of entry for me in terms of everything. I used to be too tentative with starting things, you know, things that are outside of my comfort zone, or even those that are, I know I have done, but it's a significant amount of effort that I hesitate to start, right? Because once you start something, there's a possibility of failure. But if I think about incompletion, okay, you know, I can start with something. Imperfection, okay, it's wrong, so it is, right? Incompletion, imperfection, impermanence, yes, things don't last, and they're bound to change. So therefore, I can do something. It all can change tomorrow. And so I know with my collaborators, sometimes this actually is, I'm sometimes maybe even over-index on these things a little bit, because I am very willing to do things that are, I think there's a distinction between like operating in a wabi-sabi manner and not being thoughtful, right? Or in English, we say doing something half-assed, right? So I still want to be considered, but I am willing for it to be not completely thought through, in that I don't have all the data, or I don't have all the, I don't have, it's not like I can write a business analysis about it, right? I don't have sufficient data to do something, but I have an impulse, and I have a desire to do it. And I feel like it's something that should be experimented with, that there's a reason why I want this thing to exist in the world. So I you know, a lot of us talked about trust. So for me, it's a part of trusting, and these principles have enabled me to trust my actions and also the process, whether it's coming from me or coming from others. It simply made things easier, because I think we all have perfectionistic tendencies, especially as a professional and so on. So the bar can be very seemingly high. So this is a way to like puncture that barrier.
So beautiful. Ying. This notion of wabi-sabi is for me like the kernel of wisdom. And it resonates also with one of my favorite people, which is Chuang Tzu. And this openness to life with like no pretension to know where it's going or but with a deep gratitude, a serious playfulness.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, it's really interesting that that quote about the chain of destiny, right? If we can even think of big, serious things in that way, only one step can be handled at a time. It does create a lightness.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Shantina. Denise, I think you had one more question.
Oh, nope, sorry, I'll lower my hand. But I do deeply admire the way that you speak in terms of how you soulfully blend such astute business ideas and language with the spiritual way of you have faith in yourself and how you make that come together so easily. It's just a terrific role model to see you speak like this and think like this in your actions. So I deeply appreciate your presentation and your words.
Thank you so much, Denise. Thank you. When I shared, some of this with my team, I was delightfully surprised at how they took to it. And I'm sure many of you have similar experience. I think young people today, especially, they really do have a somewhat different level of consciousness, right? They're so aware of the climate crisis, and they know like things are not going to be secure, right? There's a sense of depth that so they helped me to be able to speak these things and weave these things together within the corporate conference room.
I love what you have shared about insecurity, impermanence. Walking the walk in Italy, I went up to a castle high in the mountains. And it was quite an imposing structure, but falling down. And at some stage, the inhabitants of that castle felt secure. And now it is just a crumbling structure. And I came to the awareness that there is no security in the material world. The security is being in the world in all its dimensions for me. And so you've reminded me of that so beautifully in the ink in the water.
Presentation. I've always loved the idea of wabi-sabi because it allowed me to embrace my own imperfections. It also allowed me to, if you like, experiment. I think experimentation is the heart of creativity. But the way that you've linked it all up together this evening is as Denise said, is marvelous. And thank you so much.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you.